Thank you, Ushma and Diane, for kicking this off. So up till now, we've heard some different perspectives. A scope of work is multifaceted. It could be used as a tool to help facilitate discussions with a sponsor or participant, to help you understand what you have to offer, what the participant or sponsor needs, to help find some mutually agreeable overlapping area of research. But a scope of work is more than that too. As Diane said right at the outset, it becomes an integral part of the contract. So the TCP folks will look at it as a business development tool, and the lawyers will look at it as a contract vehicle. And it's important to know that those aren't mutually exclusive, because fundamentally what a contract is the expectations of each party. These expectations are set through discussions, but they need to be memorialized. What you can hold your sponsor accountable to in terms of payment, timeline, deliverables, and vice versa. Your sponsor wants to know what it is that you're doing for them. How are you going to proceed? What are they going to get in terms of research? Publications, potentially patents. These are all great conversation pieces to have, but they need to be reflected not in a series of emails. Here we call that the scope of work, because it, as Diane said originally, gets attached, stapled to the contract, and becomes a term and condition no different than all the others. So it is more than just a description of work. A scope of work is a material part of the contract, and it does set the expectations. So please make sure that when you're drafting a scope of work, you really think through it stepwise. When I made the transition from being an engineer to going into law school, my writing style was very different from those of my classmates. They were very much used to long philosophical prose, whereas an engineer or a scientist, you're used to very much stepwise. First this, and perhaps a couple more steps, a couple more conditions, forking logic trees, but you're used to that. And that is a real asset, especially when it comes to drafting a contract. So a lot of the scopes of work and a lot of the contracts that I see here are through hard work, better than a lot of the stuff that I've seen out there. So I want you all to take a moment, those who have gone through this process, to know that this is a really robust and talented group of folks. And unto that end, there are samples. So we've been talking through some of the process, but we do have samples, and your division rep has samples. Because this is videotaped and because we treat all of our sponsors and participants' information very carefully, we don't want to share samples here, but if you ever need any samples, feel free to email TCP or myself. But really, I'm pointing out here that the scope of work is part of a package. It can be viewed by many things to many people. A business development tool, many of you, when you go to submit this for approval, will submit it into our PEARL system, our proposal management system. And these are all the types of documents that will go along with it. And you can see that the statement of work is really called out as its own thing and very important. You need all the approvals, you need to identify whether there's a subcontract, you need to understand who the participants are and what the budgets are, but it's one document that gets uploaded. But I want you to, as you go through the process and as you upload, remember that this is going to be part of the contract. So it should really be a well-polished document. Now, for those of you that are more checklist-oriented, just keep in mind that these are many of the key elements of a scope of work, or a statement of work, I should say. There's the why Argonne piece, and this is, in my opinion, the most important. You'll hear a little bit more about the DOE approval process in brief, but really understand that we need to be selling not only to our sponsors, but also to our program managers and also to the DOE why this is good for the lab. And so just understand that you can achieve many different goals by articulating a very good why Argonne. What are our unique capabilities? The background. Well, how did you two get to the table? What is the arrangement? Did they approach you at a conference? Maybe you don't need to go into that level of detail, but maybe explain what we do and what they need, what their business is. So a paragraph or two about Argonne, our capabilities in your area, a paragraph or two on what the sponsor does. Especially if you're dealing with a company with many different business units, what does this business unit want? The budget, of course, always plays a central role, and that's reflected here. Everything flows from that. So it's important to have robust discussions around how much is this going to cost. And that can be a lot to bite off. So putting in there some tasks, some milestones, some assumptions, some deliverables. Those are terms I'm going to go into in the next slide, but these are all just tools. These are ways to break out who's doing what, in what order, and what needs to happen before then. So to define those terms a little bit, tasks. These are activities to be performed. You may be drafting, you may be programming, testing. You notice a lot of ing words. These are active verbs. You will be engaged in activities. The output of those activities, those can be called deliverables. So you may run a test. What is your output of the test? Perhaps a sample, perhaps test data, perhaps code. These are all valid outputs. Milestones. This is another term of art, another thing that I always want you to consider whenever you're drafting. These are interim events, tasks, or deliverables for measuring progress. These are your midterms. What have you done? After year one, what does the sponsor need in order to continue? And this is a great way of discussing what is the sponsor's goal, because it really forces you to write down, it's not just you doing the research, which is important, but it's also understanding what do they need in order for this to be successful to them? Do they need 2 peer-reviewed journals? If so, that's good to know. Do they need proprietary information so that they can develop a new product for launch in calendar year 2019? That's a really tight timeline for those of you in product development. Outside of software, that could be quite the push. So it's important to talk about what do you need in order to measure success? How do you know when you're going to be on track? So please, feel free to use those liberally. And a go, no-go event. This is an event or milestone that allows the sponsor or participant to back out, to say, well, we didn't hit our goal. Maybe we didn't get to the stated reduction in noise or stated increase in energy storage in terms of cycles of material, and that's okay. But one of the real assets of having a go, no-go decision, it allows your sponsor to become more comfortable. As Ushma indicated, usually scopes of work start small. Trust has to be developed. It's no different in any other service industry. Whether you're going to a doctor, going to a lawyer, hiring someone to renovate your kitchen, you need to start with some project. You start big. You don't just walk up to a stranger and say, build me a house. It's a trust relationship, and that's something that needs to be developed. Go, no-go decisions allow folks the opportunity to say, if it's not working out by such and such a date, we'll back away. And frankly, we've seen longer-term projects, longer-term scopes of work that have go, no-go decisions because it helps build comfort to the sponsor, that they have a way out and that everybody knows what the expectations are. So skipping forward to the next slide, the scope of work really defines the work to be performed by the laboratory for a third party. And this is so critically important. Research outcomes here cannot be guaranteed. That's why we're here, because we're at the bleeding edge of science. And so it's important to understand that when you talk to your sponsor about what you hope to achieve, maybe it's a certain amount of production, maybe you want to make 5 grams of a particular type of material. You can't guarantee that. And that's one of the things that is very mushy in our business, understanding exactly where the boundaries are and what you can guarantee. And that's where we rely on you, the PI, to identify what do I know I can do. Maybe I know I can make a report, I know I can make the samples in such and such a fashion, but do I really know that I can deliver a kilogram? I don't know. When you start to ask yourself, I don't know if I can do that, it's best to leave it out of the scope of work or to substitute something that is more achievable. Like, I will do this test, I will use whatever it is, amount of material in this process, and I hope to get a kilogram, for example. So that's really the background. It's setting the expectations, and those were, I guess, the bullet points, how it fits into the proposal package that goes into Pearl, and how all the pieces of the scope of work come together. And again, we have samples, so don't feel free. But just because we have samples doesn't mean you have to start with a sample. I've often struggled in my career when I'm faced with a blank sheet of paper less than I have when I've struggled with a template. because a template is good in certain circumstances. It helps you understand what you need to include. But very rarely are two circumstances even close to each other. So while it's good to have a template as a frame of reference to include some language that you can borrow, you might want to consider starting afresh, really setting the expectations, because then you're not just taking someone else's work and you're thinking, and in doing so, in drafting your own, you're thinking through all the situations. Well, I will make this, I will do this step. Well, maybe I won't do that step. Actually, it made sense there because their objectives were something different. It's a forcing function. However you like to write, there is no wrong way to write, but it is important that we do hit on all of these topics. So with that, a little bit about the basics of drafting and the philosophy of drafting a scope of work. Well, let me actually first take this a little bit more interactive. Show of hands, how many people in this room have drafted a proposal for the Department of Energy? Okay, a really good number, especially gathered in the back. I don't know what I'll read into that. How many of you have drafted a scope of work before? Show of hands? Okay. And for those that have done both, which there are a large number of folks here in the audience, for those on videotape watching, they're very different. And I'm sure you can understand that. And those that have lived it really see that difference. And it's important to understand that when you're drafting a proposal, for example, you will have footnotes, you will have references, you will have beautiful charts, and that is part of it. You're proving that the science is something worthy. Here, you already have a sponsor who is willing to invest. They understand the science. And what you're really talking about is not the background so much, but with the foreground. Where do you want to go? Who's going to do what? So the background is important. It is never to be neglected, but it is subordinate to the tasks. Who is going to do what? And so it's hard for some folks starting their career to change gears from proposal drafting, which many folks are used to, especially in academia, over to scope of work drafting for industry. So I found a resource online that I wanted to share with all of you, and it's DARPA's philosophy. And it's simple. They've been using it for a couple of decades now, but it's really to the point, and it really is more motivational than it is, shall we say, prescriptive. But just understand that we are here today to give you some philosophy. What is the mindset in which you should approach a scope of work? Yes, it should be a full story of who's going to do what, but try to avoid the technical jargon. What are the limits on what you're going to do? If there's any caveats, maybe it's power of a machine, maybe it's beam time, make sure that those are reflected. What is your approach? That's perhaps more important than the why do you think it will be successful, but just what is the process that you're going to use? Who cares? Well, DOE cares, your sponsor cares, Argonne Legal cares, but who cares could be rephrased slightly differently as what is someone going to get out of that, which goes right into the next one. What are the risks and payoffs? What does the sponsor want out of this? Samples, data, processes, patents, proprietary information. These are all really good questions to ask them. How can you be successful? How can I help you be successful? How much will it cost? Great question. Great question. How long will it take? This one's a little bit tricky here in FFRDC land because, as I'm sure some of you know all too well, things take time, sometimes more time than we care to. But it's important that folks understand what the timeline is to approval and what the timeline is for the research. Again, cutting edge research, it often takes a little bit longer. So it's important that your sponsor know that. And then midterms or final exams, go, no-go decisions. What are the deliverables? Did you meet your metrics? Again, you'll have all the slides, but I would encourage you, maybe print this one out, put it up on your wall. Whenever you think about dealing with a sponsor, it's not a checklist, but it's a good frame of reference. It's a good tool. And so with that, I do want to relay another tool, or perhaps more rules, and these are the 3 golden rules for drafting a quality scope of work. So the first one is almost the first rule of anything drafting. Know your audience. And we'll go into that one in more detail. Be clear. And that means being as articulate as possible, understanding that there are many folks like myself who did not get their PhD, who stand in awe of the great research that all of you do, but probably couldn't parse out half of your nature journals. So keep in mind that folks like myself will be the ones who will be taking a look at it. So my request, go easy on us. And then the third one, you saw a preview, promise only what you know you can deliver. And that is really important. This is the primary cause of, shall we say, disagreement or discrepancy between a sponsor's expectations and what we do. And we'll go into all of those in more detail, starting with know your audience. Oh my goodness gracious, isn't that a long list? There are a lot of folks that take a look at this, and for good reason. We are a federally funded research and development center. We have a very unique relationship with the DOE. And I've tried to explain this to some of my other lawyer friends. And I say, well, imagine if you work in finance. And imagine if the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, is not only your regulator, but also your landlord and also your investor. It's a very complicated relationship, which is why many folks within the DOE need to sign off. And it's very important. I did throw in DOE sort of at the bottom, but there are a number of stakeholders there, and it's always important to remember that even though we're doing work for third parties, that it still needs to be aligned with DOE mission, at least not inconsistent with DOE mission, and we need to make sure that we have DOE program office approval, or it might be DHS program office approval, some federal program office approval. And then it'll go through Sean Seaman, who's sitting here in the audience today, who's our contracting officer. He's what I refer to as ASO, Argonne Site Office, and potentially DOE Legal for review of IP terms or other terms, and potentially DOE HQ. And we'll go more into that little aspect later. But look at all the different folks here that review it. Export control. Are we dealing with a foreign national country, or foreign national, or a foreign controlled interest? Are there any concerns about the technology? Counterintelligence, do we know who we're dealing with? We may have vetted them at the technical level, they may seem very interested, but are they really somebody that we should be dealing with? And every year you take that training. How many of you remember that training, the video training that you take every year where the ex-KGB officer tells you that you are a target? Yes, I'm sure many of you remember that. I don't know if we're still using that one. But it's true. It's true. We are at the cutting edge of science and technology, and so we always have to be cautious that we know who we're dealing with. So just keep your wits about you when you're meeting someone new. You don't need to be cloak and dagger, as I say, but just be aware. And when we start to enter into a contract, we really need to know who we're dealing with and what their goals are. TCP, Argonne Legal, I'll take a look at it. Sponsors, legal department. And this is really where I wanted to highlight that it's not just an Argonne issue. At many companies, especially the companies that are fortunate enough to have the revenue and the profit to invest in basic R&D here at the lab, they have a very big infrastructure. So you may be dealing with a tech rep in Stuttgart, Germany, who needs to run it through their contracts lawyer in Farmington Hills, Michigan. And the two have never met. They drop it into a system and it just goes away until something comes back, as things always do from the lawyer's office, with questions or clarifications or red lines. And it's important to know that that lawyer in Farmington Hills, Michigan, that contracting officer on their side, isn't going to understand the science any more than the average contracting officer. That obviously they'll have expertise in their area of automotive software, but they'll need it to be at a level that's comprehensible. So please remember that everyone has a different background, and it's okay to keep the technical details at a high level, just as long as it's clear what you're doing, in what order, and how much it's going to cost. So that's a little bit about the philosophy that, the first golden rule is keep in mind your reviewers, keep in mind that folks are asking, well, why is this good for the lab? Why is this good for DOE? And that is a positive feedback cycle. You take that frame of reference when you draft your why Argonne section. You remember the puzzle piece. That goes right into there. So the second, how do you tell a clear story? Well, I go back to basics, the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, the how. This is the second graphic you've seen today. Ushma had it earlier in different format. And it is just basic. It's just make sure that you hit on every one. And it becomes trickier when you're doing a scope of work. This isn't This isn't pedantic. This is a good tool, because when you're drafting a scope of work, it's always good to remember who is the person doing the action. So every so often I get a scope of work that says we. Well, maybe there's 2 divisions involved at Argonne and a sponsor. So is that 1 division, 2 divisions, or is it a combination? That becomes very important in terms of setting the budget. Who's handling it, who's responsible? Just an example. But it's always good to go back to basics and keep that in mind. Now, in terms of style, earlier I said that there is no right way or wrong way to write. It's just your style. And I firmly believe that this is a reflection of you and your research. It should be written in your own prose. But if I might make a suggestion, when you're thinking about drafting, you probably don't want to write like William Shakespeare or Faulkner. You probably want to write more like Ernest Hemingway. The Man, the Sea, the Sun Also Rises. Very short, very sweet, very succinct. Paint the image with as few words as possible. In fact, when I was in law school, I had my 1L professor for legal writing. He would say, every sentence you take, just take out half the words. See if you can reduce it by a factor of a half. And if you can do that habitually, you start to understand that a lot of language is superfluous. So we want you to keep these scopes of work to a reasonable length. Obviously, a half a paragraph for $1 million project is not proportional, but neither does it need to be 20 pages or 10 pages or 7 pages. On average, 3 pages. That's usually what I see. It doesn't need to be too long, and that includes the budget, a little bit of the background, a little bit of the deliverables, including a report to OSTI. So just keep in mind that short is good. Of course, just for your reference, I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but it's just important to remember the rules of formal writing. Because this is a contract, conjunctions, avoid those, avoid the passive voice. Who's the actor? Who's doing this? It will be done is quite different from Argonne will be doing it, which is quite different from the sponsor will be doing it. Avoiding pronouns, and of course some resources. This second bullet point, the Microsoft Word readability statistics, an interesting little tool. Everyone has it. It's part of the Microsoft suite. Just select all your text and drop down, and you'll get to see, well, how complex is this? And it'll rank it somewhere from doctoral level to primary school, and it's the sweet spot is obviously somewhere in the middle. Now, this third point, this third rule of formal writing, promise only what you know you can deliver. This is the third bullet point to how to draft a good scope of work. Define the task specifically and make sure that they can be performed. Limit the deliverable to reports where possible, not specific performance criteria, items or products, because you may not know that you can deliver on that. All right, let me give you 2 examples of this to really take it from the abstract to the more specific. And I'm going to do a little bit of foreshadowing that these 2 examples each have something that I think could be improved upon. The first example is Argonne will synthesize 5 samples having X properties. Now maybe that's certain level of conductivity, certain electrochemical properties. Make that by performing steps 1 through 5, and will provide the output to the sponsor along with the data reports. In my opinion, everything is okay with this one except with guaranteeing that we'll have X properties. Perhaps saying something more like the material that we put in will have X properties, talking about the inputs rather than the outputs. Otherwise, that's a pretty good, succinct summary of what the first task will be. Example 2, Argonne will manufacture 5 grams of samples with X properties. We have the X properties again, which is problematic, but also consider the totality of the context. Is 5 grams a lot or a little? I defer to you. I always defer to the PIs as to what they think is capable, but I would always encourage, if you're in doubt, if it's something you've never tried before, consider instead saying we will use X quantities of input and we will provide you whatever comes out. We hope it's 5 grams, but one never knows. It could be 2.5, it could be 1. This is just a rough rule of thumb. It's not anything there's nothing magical about 5 grams, but just keep in mind that you're really promising something to your sponsor when you do this. And your sponsor takes it seriously. They're investing money in you, and your research, and you want them to know that there are certain limitations, but we have a 70-year reputation of doing great science here, and that's something to stand behind. So before we move into tips and tricks, and Diane's going to talk about this, I've been talking for a little bit. I've gone through some of the philosophy. Ushma has talked about how the scope of work is a conversation and expectation setting tool with a sponsor. I explained how it really will be something that the lab will be held to, and it's important that we understand what that is. So I want to pause and I want to allow opportunity for questions at this point before we move into more of the advanced, more of the, what are the pitfalls, what are the tips, what are the tricks. So I just want to pause and give a moment here. Yes? And these, I'm sorry, just before you go on. And so these questions, we have a microphone, so please speak up because this will be recorded. Thank you.
So at DOE, what they like is SMART milestones, and the M stands for measurable. And you just said don't make it measurable in terms of quantities and things. So how do you rectify?
It's a great question. I mean, if you think about J. Caesar, 555, that's one that's been touted. And I think that it's important to understand that it's a bit of a balancing act. Did we promise that we would deliver on 555 with 100% certainty? No. We said we would try our best, and there have been substantial milestones and progress made onto that point. So it's a little bit of a balancing act. I think it's important to say that we are going to shoot for X properties, and we will have a go, no-go decision if we can meet such an outcome. So what I always encourage folks to do is to consider, is this something that I can promise to deliver on, or is this something that we can make a go, no-go decision out of? And certainly saying, hard and fast, we will do this. If you can't make it, that's it. That's the project goes away with the DOE. They'll say, we're not going to fund you anymore. Bear in mind, it's different with a sponsor. Their frame of reference is, well, I paid you X to deliver on this. You didn't deliver on this. So think about it in terms of renovating your house. I paid you to renovate my kitchen. You didn't. Give me my money back. Let me pay for somebody else. That's not an option here at the National Labs. It's a valid point, and it really comes down to one of language and drafting. And it can be tempting to say, well, we'll do it and we'll do our best. And that's what we say in the contract, but it's also good to set that expectation that this is what we're shooting for, and to the extent possible, couch it as a go, no-go decision would be my short advice. But if you ever have any questions, of course, you've got resources here to help you work through that and wordsmith it, because language matters. Good question.
On that, it's not only a go, no-go decision, but sometimes it's a go, no-go, or redirect. So when you're dealing with sponsored research, we have the benefit to be able to work in some of that language to make sure that this is R&D, let's face it. We don't, we can't promise too terribly, we can't promise to, fix global warming in 6 months from now, right? So, I mean, that's just a reality that we have to deal with when it's R&D. But we can build into these statements of work ability to redirect. So, what is that? It comes really basics to what Ushma was saying, as well as what Pete was saying, that if we understand what their ultimate goal is, if we can't reach that goal with that particular direction, then you can have a redirect and say, okay, this particular thing didn't work, but in the process of the work that we've already delivered for you, potentially we can go in this direction and to be able to continue the work. So we'll talk a little bit about scope creep and how to make sure that we mitigate scope creep, because you may have to amend that statement of work to clearly define what new direction you're going to take, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a no-go and you're done with that particular sponsor. So it's important for that sponsor relationship to have a point where you can potentially redirect to still meet whatever problem solving they need to have, and why you're bringing some science to bear on it.
And this is a really good point that we could build off of. The relationship should be reflected in the contract. The expectations of the relationship should be reflected in the contract. But that doesn't mean relationships are stagnant. They are far from that. And times change, objectives change. So the contract says what people will do. But that can be revisited, and and the way to do that is to maintain a robust relationship with your sponsor or participant. Because really having that discussion, that dialogue, well, we probably aren't going to be able to meet that, but we did find all this other great, interesting research. How would you like to go down this role? And that really comes down to an art of drafting scopes of work. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all. I'm going to turn it back over to Diane.